this evening. I would like to make a couple notes or a couple of reminders here before we get started, though. If you, well, let's put it this way, don't take it for granted. If you have a cell phone, please check it to make sure it's off. It's a little unnerving when one of those goes off during the lecture. Every lecture here is webcast live, so if you happen to see a notice for a lecture in the future at some point that you are not able to attend physically, you can join the lecture via the internet from anywhere in the world. And we have some who joined us this evening via the internet, and we want to welcome them as well to the lecture. The people who join us on the internet have a chance to see the slides, as well as hear the audio, and even ask questions at the end of the lecture, just as you do. And every lecture here is edited with live video that's taken during the lecture, interspersed, and then archived on the museum's website, so that the educational value continues long after the actual lecture. The lecture this evening is on Carrère and Hastings, and it's a topic of special interest to me because we talk a lot about Volk and Meisner and other architects here in Palm Beach, but in fact, Carrère and Hastings get very little attention, and yet they were internationally known. They completed quite a number of projects, and when they were very young, Henry Flagler gave them their first big break to build the Hotel Ponce de Leon, the Alcazar, the Memorial Church, and one other building at St. Augustine, with plans to do even more at some point. And so their careers he must have taken a lot of pride as their careers flourished over the next couple of decades, and they were the obvious choice when it came time to build Whitehall. So, for example, at the time they were working here on Whitehall, they also were working on the Russell Senate Office Building in Washington, the New York Public Library in New York, of course, the Cosmos Club in Washington, and the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo. Those were all pretty big commissions. And following this project, they worked on the Gannon House Office Building in Washington, the Carnegie Institution in Washington, Nemours, DuPont's home, the Frick Collection, and the William Starr Miller House, which is now the Neue Gallery in New York. So, and that's just to name a few. You're going to hear about many more this evening. Very prolific architects, terrific architects, and they've left us a great legacy here in Palm Beach. Here to talk to us tonight about Carrère and Hastings are Laurie, Ossman, and Heather Ewing. They've just published a book put out by Rizzoli on Carrère and Hastings works. It's a richly illustrated book, lots of information. They're here to talk to us about the careers of Carrère and Hastings, who, after all, were Beaux-Arts trained, who had worked in probably the greatest architectural firm in America, McKenzie & White, before striking out on their own in their mid-20s when Flagler gave them their first big break. Laurie is a former director of Woodlawn Plantation and Pope Leahy House, and has a lot of experience messing about with Gilded Age homes. She worked at Newport and Whitehall here for a couple of years, Cottazon and Vizcaya, so she's been around these homes a lot and knows her stuff. Heather Ewing is an architectural historian and research associate with the Smithsonian Institution, and the author of numerous books. So they made a great team, I think, in putting this lecture together, and it's my pleasure to welcome here this evening. Please join me in welcoming here to the Flagler Museum. I should just note here that Heather is going to begin the lecture talking about the private commissions, and Laurie will follow up talking about the public commissions for Carrère and Hastings.
Can you all hear me okay? Yes? Okay. Great. Okay. It's natural that the cover of our book should feature the New York Public Library, the building for which Carrère and Hastings best known. This is Astor Hall, the magnificent marble entryway with the staircases, one on each side, that begin the steady monumental ascent to the great reading room at the crown of the building. The architects considered absolutely everything, designing the reading tables, the lamps, and even the wastebaskets. The classical torchères in the entry hall, one of which you can see there on the left, is a good example. But I want you to cast a quick glance at the far left, kind of washed out in this slide, on the wall where there is inscribed the many names of the donors to the building. It's a good and helpful key to understanding this remarkable firm and to our having a discussion tonight of Carrère and Hastings and their architects as products, not just of the firm, but of the firm in relation to the social, political, and professional milieu of the American Renaissance. Patronage lay at the heart of these people's work. And it's especially fitting to open this discussion here at Whitehall because Henry Flagler, as you just heard, was the firm's most important patron. And through him, I've added a little slide on the right so that you can see him more at the age at which he was when he was the patron of Carrère and Hastings at the start. Through him, they and their work were introduced to many of their other most significant clients. I'm going to walk you through a little of this somewhat incestuous Gilded Age world that helped give rise to this architecture, focusing mainly, as you heard, on private commissions, and give you a window into some of the companions that Whitehall has in other parts of the country. And then I'll turn it over to Laurie to expand on their public work, the professional world that they moved in, and the legacy that they left to American architecture. Flagler's connection to these architects was at its heart a very personal one. He moved to New York City in 1877 to manage the Standard Oil Company partnership, which he had recently founded with John D. Rockefeller, and which was soon to become one of the world's earliest and largest multinational corporations. In New York City, Flagler lived on Fifth Avenue in the 40s, seen here near the Croton Reservoir, which is this great Egyptian structure at the right, and which sits coincidentally on the site of what became Carrère and Hastings' New York Public Library building. Flagler's house was a block away from West Presbyterian Church, where he became a congregant and developed a close relationship with the minister, who was none other than the architect Thomas Hastings' father, who was also called Thomas Hastings. And Thomas Hastings, the architect's grandfather, who was also called Thomas Hastings, was another prominent Presbyterian, renowned church musician who set Rock of Ages to music. Another Presbyterian that Flagler met at this time, also living in the same neighborhood and attending the same church, was a businessman named E.C. Benedict. Flagler and Benedict, like the architect Thomas Hastings, were both sons of Presbyterian ministers. And their friendship was solidified through marriage. If you can bear with me a moment, this is fairly complicated, but Benedict's niece was married to the Reverend Thomas Hastings' other son, the architect's brother, whose name was Frank. And then later, Flagler's daughter, Jenny Louise, married E.C. Benedict's son. And eventually, even the architect, Tommy Hastings, married Benedict's daughter, Helen. So all of these close family connections undergirded Henry Flagler's relationship with Carrère and Hastings and their architecture. So these young men, John Mervyn Carrère on the left and Thomas Hastings on the right, in the late 1870s were just getting their start. Carrère had been born in Rio de Janeiro, where his dad had carted the family off from Baltimore to pursue business in the coffee trade, a trip that had resulted in Carrère ultimately being sent to boarding school in Switzerland. And Hastings, as you've already heard, had grown up in the bosom of this long line of Presbyterian ministers with his father, who later became the head of the Union Theological Seminary in New York, at the center of an influential network of liberal religious intelligentsia. But Hastings, described as a child as sensitive, high-strung, and delicate, didn't continue in this family business. He found his place instead in the world of art and design. Both young men soon headed to Paris, where it's possible that they met, to study in the École des Beaux-Arts, the premier training ground for American architects in the late 19th century. The building is in the 6th arrondissement near the Abbaye de Saint-Germain-des-Prés, and the courtyard, as you can see here, is filled with monuments and architectural fragments of important buildings, many of which had been looted from churches during the French Revolution. The history of architecture was something that was heavily emphasized in their training, that these young men were part of a continuum of design from classical antiquity, and that they were carrying this legacy forward into the future. Here, Carrère and Hastings took on ideas that permeated their work for the rest of their lives, a focus on plan in particular, and on the unified idea of the building and the environment around it, and also on the symbolic message of architecture. So they came back to the United States in the early 1880s, about a year apart, and they both entered the office of McKim, Mead & White, the preeminent American architectural firm of the day, and where they most certainly got to know each other if they didn't already. In mid-1884, while they were at McKim, Mead & White, Hastings got his first private commission on the side, a little job for who else but Henry Flagler, who was asking him to design a library addition to his house in Mamaroneck, New York, just outside of the city. And within a year, Carrère and Hastings had set out on their own, with McKim, Mead & White kindly offering them space at the back of their offices to work from. So here they sat, as Carrère once later recounted, together with an office boy waiting for something to turn up. And then one day, Hastings was summoned by Flagler. And since this little library addition in Mamaroneck was all that the architects had done so far, they assumed that they had messed up. But instead, after an hour of waiting, Carrère suddenly found every door was being slammed and books and directories were flying through the air. Carrère explained years later, above the din and confusion, I heard Mr. Hastings shout, "We're going to Florida, and we've got $1 million hotel to build there." So then we proceeded to smash everything we could lay our hands on, our office boy ably assisting us. Of course, we didn't know anything about hotels. In fact, they were 24 and 26 years old, and neither of them had ever built a building before. The Florida commissions, for one followed after another, made these architects' careers. Henry Flagler set out to create an American Riviera, a kind of winter Newport at St. Augustine, which he had discovered while honeymooning with his second wife. And a landmark hotel, a real statement, was needed to distinguish and elevate his development. So the Ponce de Leon, the hotel the young architects designed for Flagler, conjured up images of Renaissance Spain, building on the Spanish colonial heritage still so evident in St. Augustine, the oldest city in the US. The elaborate ornament on both the interior and the exterior further heightened these associations. The architects worked closely with a number of artists, a tradition that they continued throughout their career, and in fact they were known for remaining unusually involved in the decorative and sculptural programs of their buildings. In Flagler's eyes, to make St. Augustine a real destination, of course, one hotel was not enough. And so he acquired the plaza in the center of town and commissioned the Alcazar Hotel across the way, a place that was to offer spa and recreation amenities for the whole complex. This is what was once the pool, and the pool even had an underwater passage from the dressing rooms. And it also offered more affordable hotel rooms than those at the Ponce de Leon. With the construction of this building, the architects employed their Beaux-Arts planning skills to the utmost, transforming St. Augustine into a kind of idealized Renaissance town. The central plaza, with its elaborate fountain and formal parterres linking the courtyards of the two hotels, created a stunning classical ensemble. It was, in fact, the exact kind of monumental image making that the École had trained them to do. And they were doing it, in fact, before any of their peers or even their mentors. Some 6 years later, at the famed White City, the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition set the template for what became known as the City Beautiful movement, but in a way, Carrère and Hastings were doing it much before. And so after that became two churches for Flagler, Grace Methodist and the Flagler Memorial Presbyterian, a memorial to his daughter Jenny Louise, who, as I mentioned earlier, was married to Benedict's son, and who had tragically died in childbirth a year after the opening of the Ponce de Leon. And Flagler himself also was eventually buried here. Carrère and Hastings' accomplishments in St. Augustine were not only a powerful statement of American cultural ascendance, they were also technologically remarkably innovative, which is something that the firm is not typically recognized for. These buildings introduced modern concrete technology to the United States. They built the largest monolithic concrete dome that had been seen in the West since the Pantheon, and they also created the largest fully electrified building complex to date in the U.S. The impact of these buildings for American architecture and urban planning generally lasted long after the construction. And as you heard, the work, of course, launched their career. The extensive publicity these projects realized, including an entire issue of American Architect and Building News, led to many, many new commissions, including some more hotels. The Jefferson in Richmond might be one that you're familiar with. And this close social network that I talked about, in particular, remained essential to their advancement. Among these many projects that followed, E.C. Benedict called on the architects to design his house in Connecticut, another one of these works that was going on while the Whitehall was being built. It's called Indian Harbor in Greenwich. And this complex at the end of a secluded peninsula was carefully laid out by the architects in this classic Beaux-Arts fashion. They considered the environs of the building, which they called the sauce of the architecture, as important as the building itself, as I mentioned before. And the grounds also, if you look to the far left, you see a secondary house, and that was for Frank Hastings, Tommy Hastings' brother, who had since become personal secretary to E.C. Benedict. So Benedict kept his yacht, the Oneida, moored right at the foot of the house in a channel adjacent to Long Island Sound. And this was the boat on which President Grover Cleveland secretly had the malignant tumor in his jaw removed. And it was also the boat on which Tommy Hastings and Helen Benedict set off on their honeymoon, which you can see here. And in the foreground is the architect McKim, who is the best man. And Stanford White was one of the ushers, and Stanford White's son was the page. And many of the others of this circle, this social network, were either in the wedding or attending it. There were about 1,000 people there. The yacht was also the site of much socializing, and from the Oneida logbook, which still exists, we know that Benedict introduced Hastings to about 20 additional clients on various outings. They were, of course, brought to fame, above all, by winning the competition for the New York Public Library. And from here, they went on to design churches, libraries, university buildings, banks, theaters, municipal buildings, bridges, tombs, monuments, and even city plans. And of course, many residences, a number of which were so monumental, like this one, that they have since been adapted for other use. Museums and schools and conference centers and hotels and the like. Of Flagler's Standard Oil partners, for example, Oliver Hazard Payne had the architects design him an Italianate marble palace on the banks of the Hudson River. This is about directly across from Hyde Park, where the Roosevelt compound is. It has a beautiful courtyard, also like the Flagler. And Payne, like Benedict, also kept his yacht at the foot of the grounds. Today it's owned by Marist College, and for Alfred DuPont in Delaware, Nemours, now a museum. This house had, like many of Carrère and Hastings' houses, bowling alley and multi-car garage. And for DuPont, he did a second house in a very different style. White Eagle in Old Westbury, Long Island, which is now owned by New York Institute of Technology. For another railroad titan, E.H. Harriman, who was one of those who was often on Benedict's yacht, the firm created Arden House up in the Hudson River Valley, one of the largest houses in the United States at the time, 1909, when it was built. It was on the top of a mountain, required a funicular to be built to bring the building materials up to the top of the site. It also had the latest construction technology and electricity, as well as a pneumatic vacuuming system that was built into the walls, and that was reportedly so powerful that it lifted a Turkish rug right off the floor the first time they tested it out. So while Harriman requested his architects to build him something particularly American, and got this rambling baronial pile that's fairly unusual and not perhaps Carrère and Hastings' best work, just a few miles up the road, and at one point the two houses could see each other. That's no longer true. But in Chester, New York, Carrère and Hastings built this impeccable Tuscan villa at the demands of clients Robert Gillette, whose family had founded Chemical Bank, and his wife. The famed landscape architect Beatrix Ferrand, who they hired to do the grounds, had called it a pink stucco Tuscan erection, a thimble on a bald head. And she said it was about as suited to its isolated New York hilltop as a wig on a soup tureen. The day that we were there was, as you can see, completely spectacular, so this is probably the house at its best. Imagine in January it doesn't look quite as cozy and Mediterranean. But today it's a luxury boutique hotel, and it's really spectacular the way it's been restored. So these two neighbors offer a great example of the tremendous diversity of styles that Carrère and Hastings operated in. Although we think of them today as fairly monolithically classical and occasionally somewhat staid, they brought a surprising variety of creative responses to the challenges presented by modern living. And the architects, above all, believed in the power of architecture to uplift and transform American civic life. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Laurie. Thanks.
Thank you. Is the volume level okay? This image is, I only recently found this shot of the waiting room at Carrère and Hastings offices that were taken around 1907. And it doesn't really have anything to do with anything, except I think it's a fabulous photo, and I wonder how many clients tripped over the tigers' heads. Because there are quite a few of them. It was a real obstacle course. But you can see the drawings arranged around the walls in different styles of different projects and competitions that they'd entered, and the artifacts, a Warwick vase, and the pieces of sculpture. And I think it talks a bit about what Heather had mentioned about how closely they collaborated with artists and decorators and cabinet makers in their work. And with that, we segue from the private commissions to the public. Not only were their private clients the source of the means to build these great buildings, but they were also the business, social, and cultural leaders who could influence not just fashion, but public policy. With their backing, Carrère and Hastings were key leaders of a broad movement to elevate the cultural standards of the United States, to create a visual language of architecture and fine art, to express American political, economic, and cultural ascendancy. I mean, America still had a bit of an inferiority complex at this time. This wasn't seen as a matter of innovating a completely new language. It wasn't, trying to do something wacky and deconstructed, but rather building on an existing vocabulary of the Western tradition that was assumed legible to all, as all educated people at that time had a classical background, to define an American Renaissance as a distinct and modern historical epoch. As Heather noted, Hastings grew up in New York on West 46th Street between 5th and 6th Avenue. And when his parents hired the decorating firm of Herder Brothers to redo some interiors in their houses, the young Thomas Hastings must have been hanging around and nagging because Mom and Dad talked to Christian Herder and said, "Can our son essentially intern for you?" And thus it begun. It was all beginning. Hastings arrived at the Herder Brothers firm at a highly auspicious moment when the gentleman in the hat on top, Charles B. Atwood, was working for the firm as an architect, designing the building in the foreground on the left, the William H. Vanderbilt Mansion. Just behind it, the lighter building, the Chateau on the city block, was the William K. Vanderbilt Mansion, designed by the gentleman below, Richard Morris Hunt. The Richard Morris Hunt Vanderbilt Mansion was later called by Charles Fallon McKim the first truly Beaux-Arts building in the United States. The Vanderbilt family, in building these houses, and there was a third a couple of blocks away by George B. Post, 3 architects who were very good friends, and it was a statement. It was a statement that the era of the brownstone was over, and the era of the architect and the grand European tradition had arrived. Hastings, 17-year-old kid, is drafting molding details and ornamentation while these projects are going on, and while these hugely ambitious architects are talking about this ambitious ideal that they have. Notably, in the 1885 poll of American Architect and Building News magazine, they asked architects to name the 10 greatest buildings in the United States. The William K. Vanderbilt Mansion came in third, behind the United States Capitol Building and H.H. Richardson's Trinity Church. So these were high-profile introductions to the world of big league architecture. And with the encouragement of Atwood and Hunt, that's when Hastings decided to go to the École des Beaux-Arts and essentially was enlisted by these architects to join a crusade. This crusade really had flared in the 1870s in New York when Richard Morris Hunt, again there on the bottom left, had taken on the federal government. And the story goes like this. The federal government had a competition open to all architects for a new post office building, big monumental building. And when the competition, it was very complicated and there was very little prize money involved, the government said, well, we can't choose a design, so they picked the top 5 firms, including Hunt's design and a design by James Renwick, gentleman here, seen next to his Corcoran, now Renwick Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. Took 5 high-powered architects and said, you guys get together and be a committee and come up with a compromise design. Well, the architects weren't crazy about that to begin with, but they did it because they thought, okay, the federal government is willing to give us a shot. And then the federal government said, thank you very much, took the design, turned it over to their house architect, Alfred B. Mullet, on the top left, who was not a European-trained architect, and told poor Mullet, you have to take a $4 million building and build it for $2 million, and by the way, leave off all the sculpture and all the fancy schmancy stuff that drives up the price. Now, somewhat unfairly, the New York architects really took it out on Mullet, who had a rough time of it. He still got the commission to design the State War and Navy building on the upper right, now known as the Eisenhower building, next door to the White House in Washington, D.C. But it was really a declaration of war for these architects that they needed to get their foot in the door on these major federal government buildings because they felt that the work that the government architects were doing was just not up to snuff. Richard Morris Hunt again, 1851 to 54, the first American to study in Paris at the École des Beaux-Arts. Heather's French is so much better than mine. The second, H.H. Richardson, in the early 1860s, he was hiding out in the Civil War, he was a Southerner. Charles Fallon McKim, 1867 to 70, and then a young Carrère from 79 to 82, Hastings, 80 to 83. And at the École, as Heather mentioned, The École had been founded under Louis XIV to train architects, artists, and craftsmen to design for the French monarchy. These weren't guys who were being taught to design bicycle sheds. They were being taught to design monumental rhetorical buildings for great institutions and government institutions, notably Versailles, that I show here, and on the top, 2 École drawings, one of those fabulous sort of almost abstract plans. It's like a Rorschach test, and this elaborate design at the top. And as Heather mentioned, I have to think that Hunt and McKim must have just wanted to jump off the Brooklyn Bridge when they found out that these kids, half their age, had gotten this commission to go to St. Augustine and essentially build a Beaux-Arts town from scratch, thanks to Henry Flagler. It had to be killing them. This was every Beaux-Arts architect's dream. But were they content? No. First Florida, tomorrow the world. Carrère and Hastings didn't have a big role in the world's Columbian Exposition, but they did have a role. And the gentleman in white suit and the prominent prosperous belly is Daniel Burnham. Many of you are familiar with Mr. Burnham, especially if you read Devil in the White City. When his partner Root died very early on, our friend Charles Atwood, Tommy's mentor, came in as one of the chief designers. Charles Fallon McKim, again, designed one of the buildings on the right, and Richard Morris Hunt, the administration building, which very pointedly may have recalled the U.S. Capitol building. The World's Columbian Exposition was these architects very consciously sending a message to Washington, D.C. We're out here and we're waiting. We are so ready for this. And this is what the United States, in our mind, should look like on a lagoon in Chicago. Now, Tommy and Carrère were too young, and again, there were probably some grudges there. They didn't get a building on the main court of honor. They did get a small building for the Baker Chocolate Company that was supposed to be a Viennese pavilion, which I don't normally show because I think it's just awful. It was really kind of the oddest looking little building, but they were there. Through the World's Columbian Exposition, Carrère and Hastings came particularly to the attention of Daniel Burnham, who was leading the charge and lobbying for these federal government commissions. And Burnham set his eye particularly on Carrère, who was sort of the more administrative genius of the pair. And when the position of chief government architect became available, Burnham called Carrère up and said, "You're going for it, buddy. We're putting you up." And Carrère kind of had deer in the headlights looks. Carrère later donated all of the papers and correspondence about this period and this debate to the Library of Congress. It's a wonderful record, a little insight into this moment. When he was told to go and lobby the Secretary of the Treasury, who controlled this office, to become the chief federal architect. And there was a lot of back and forth, and he would get on the train and go home late at night and have these meetings with Richard Morris Hunt and Hastings and Bruce Price and McKim and the Players Club, and they'd smoke cigars and plot this takeover. But ultimately, they decided that they needed to reform the system, not just place one of their guys at the top of it. And Carrère, with enormous relief, as he admitted it, turned down the position. And so the partnership was saved. The architects, through this process of lobbying, gained very influential political connections. And that's where this slide comes in. On the top, the lovely Andrew Zorn portrait of Senator Nelson Aldrich. His daughter married a Rockefeller, hence the whole Aldrich-Rockefeller line. Hired them to build a little place for him in Warwick Neck, Rhode Island, named Indian Oaks, seen there on the upper right in a Norman style. He also hit them up to give his son a job, his son who wanted to be an architect. The gentleman below is not that well remembered today, but probably the most influential policymaker in the turn of the century America, Elihu Root. He was the Secretary of War, then he was the Secretary of State, and then he was a senator from New York. He was a prominent attorney who represented Boss Tweed, but also most of the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the Harrimans, and most of the Carrère and Hastings stable. He knew everybody, and he was powerful in Washington. And he began by giving Carrère and Hastings the commission to build his townhouse at 71st and Park Avenue, no longer there, and a building in honor of his father at his alma mater, Hamilton College in Clinton, New York, where they built Root Hall. And again, perhaps not coincidentally, Elijah Root's college roommate at Hamilton College had been Thomas Hastings' father. So while things are simmering away on the back burner politically, and Burnham and McKim are still running around Capitol Hill screaming their heads off, there was a competition in New York for a new public library. And a public library is always a nice thing to bring to your community, but in this period, a public library was a civic symbol that the United States, like the Great Bibliothèque in Saint-Geneviève in Paris or the British Library in London, that we had culture and knowledge and made these available to the public. McKim, Mead and White, McKim again, had recently completed the Boston Public Library on the lower right, which I throw in a little slide of the École des Beaux-Arts because I think what Heather was saying, that the architects who studied at the École essentially spent the rest of their careers following what they learned as students. I think the resemblance between the two buildings suggests that McKim hadn't forgotten his lessons at the École. It was considered a shoo-in. New Yorkers were anxious to get their own monumental library to show the snooty Bostonians that, you know, they weren't the only ones with fancy education. McKim overplayed his hand and got uppity with the gentleman in the red robe, John Shaw Billings, who was the head of the committee. And McKim objected to the committee's specific directions in the program. We want, you know, this many square feet of stacks and this much and this much. And so, the building next to Mr. Billings is the Lenox Library, which was one of 3 branch libraries that was going to be replaced by the monumental New York Public Library. And so, with this design, drawn by Thomas Hastings' own fair hand, Carrère and Hastings won the competition. And part of their relationship genius with clients is they always yesed them to death until they had the contract. And then they turned around and said, well, it's going to cost twice as much as you said, and you said you wanted a brick building, but we really think it should be marble, and you said you wanted this, and they usually ended up getting their way. The New York Public Library, which was just recently cleaned and is once again white, is the white city in the city. It took the ideals of the world's Columbian Exposition and the École des Beaux-Arts and announced that Carrère and Hastings could carry that through to completion on a truly monumental scale and in an absolutely astonishing civic bureaucracy that I think would have most of us jumping off a bridge. This building, the competition was 1897, and construction, they had to remove the aqueduct, began in 1901 simultaneously with the construction of Whitehall, the building that we're in today. And sadly, it was a long project. It went on until 1911, and 6 weeks before it was due to open, Carrère was crossing Madison Avenue after a dinner party in a cab, and was hit by a passing streetcar and died and never lived to see the building completed. But Hastings went on, and although he worked with many other architects, he never changed the name of the firm from Carrère and Hastings in honor of his partner. And a few shots for those of you who haven't been in the public library lately, and also to showcase the wonderful photography, the work of Stephen Brooke in our book, hallway looking into the Rose Reading Room, the famous reading room, where, as Heather mentioned, Carrère and Hastings even designed the lamps and the chairs, every detail. And you can buy reproductions of those lamps in the shop. They're actually pretty great. And it wasn't all just the grandeur to, again, this was a palace that was available to anyone who wanted to come in and read or borrow a book. And in fact, the records show that the first book that was checked out of the New York Public Library was a treatise on potato farming. But behind the scenes, there was this fabulous, innovative, and abstract design, this use of cast iron in the book delivery room. And it functioned very much as effectively as a library did in those days. One of the big criticisms of McKim's Boston Public Library was it was beautiful for the visitor and terrible for the librarians. So Carrère and Hastings had proved in St. Augustine and the New York Public Library and the huge commissions, some of which Heather showed, that they were fully capable of taking on the United States alongside, once again, Charlie McKim, Daniel Burnham, and with the help of the gentleman at the bottom, Senator James McMillan of Michigan. They decided, if you can't beat them, join them, to go around the federal government system. And the attempts to legislate a free competition system for these major government buildings was never going to get through Congress. There were too many plum political positions to be awarded the way it was. But Macmillan had the brilliant idea of saying, well, let's just have an advisory commission of architects, and they can select the architects and the plans, and we'll use Washington, D.C. as our guinea pig. And I show the comparison there between the plan of Versailles, the White City, and the rendering from the Macmillan plan of Washington, D.C. Now, as many of you know, Washington, D.C. was designed in 1791 by a Frenchman, L'Enfant, on French Baroque planning principles. And Jefferson was inspired by French neoclassical architecture. George Washington, our founding fathers, saw a white city. But that thought had been lost over time. And through these architects, through the Macmillan Commission, thought that it was time for the United States to go back and revive and update those ideals to express that America had arrived. One of the first commissions that came up were for formal office buildings for the House and Senate, flanking the White House. The House and Senate had been renting offices haphazardly in houses and commercial buildings all around Capitol Hill. And it's always a good idea if you're going to get congressmen to sign on to a plan that costs a lot of money to tell them that their offices are going to be the first thing that benefit. And McKim was the head of the committee that oversaw that project, and he must have been still really PO'd about the New York Public Library because he basically recommended every other architect in the country before our friend Elihu Root said, and Senator Aldrich said, you know, Charlie, let's ask Tommy and Carrère to do this. And so, first, the Senate office building, which is very reverent to the Capitol. The idea wasn't to make a monument that competed with the Capitol, but to make bookends, something to enhance it, with the long colonnades of marble facing the Capitol, a motif that they derived from Perrault's east front of the Louvre, building that Jefferson said originally inspired his design for the Capitol that was not chosen. And the magnificent rotunda inside, which was inspired by Benjamin Henry Latrobe's 1814 Old Senate rotunda. So they referred to the traditions through the French, through Latrobe, back to the founding fathers. And yet every inch of it is clearly Beaux-Arts. And very similar, because you don't want to start rivalry there, the House Office building on the other side. They eventually got the commission as well to rebuild the east front of the Capitol building. And I show the vintage photograph because their work has been slightly altered. It's a contemporary photograph below. But the fundamental parts, the central portico remains as Carrère and Hastings redesigned them. So when we talk about an era where every architect's ambition was to shape the image of the United States on a monumental scale, you didn't get much closer to the heart of it than Carrère and Hastings did in their work on Capitol Hill. But wait, there's more. Senator Root happened to also be on the Board of Trustees of the Carnegie Institution. Andrew Carnegie had been involved with the New York Public Library project because he'd funded branch libraries, of which Carrère and Hastings designed 14. and was familiar with the firm, and Root did some little backstage negotiating and got them the commission for this building on 17th Street in Washington. And Carnegie wrote to Root and said, when he saw the initial plan, saying, this is a lot fancier than I had in mind. He was a good Scot. He said, you know, I really thought that the thoughts and the ideals were the point, not the building. And Root said, you know, look around you. The entire city is becoming a city of monuments. And if you want to be a truly national institution, we can't have it housed in a chicken coop. And this magnificent rotunda, I think, is still one of the most spectacular spaces in Washington, D.C. Root was also responsible when the gentleman with the remarkable beard General Judge Ivory Kimball of the Grand Army of the Republic approached Root as Secretary of War. In those days it wasn't Secretary of Defense, you were Secretary of War. And said, it's time to rebuild the amphitheater at Arlington Memorial Cemetery. The existing wooden pergola, while charming, is not grand enough to reflect the United States' newfound status in world affairs. And Root said, I'm just the architects for you. This was a commission that they began designing in 1904, and the congressional appropriation didn't come through for almost 10 years, and they went back every year. Tommy Hastings and Judge Kimball, who luckily lived to see the groundbreaking. He did die before it was completed. And the aerial view there showing the access from the Washington Monument, the arrow shows the approximate location of this amphitheater, because I think it's easy to overlook that this White City Monument in Arlington was in fact tied by Memorial Bridge to this monumental plan and revisioning under the Macmillan Plan for Washington, D.C., aggrandizing the Capitol, improving the parks, building the Lincoln Memorial, the Jefferson Memorial, and across that bridge to this amphitheater, which represented the city of the dead, tied in its ideals and its architectural nomenclature to the city of the living in the Capitol. This happens to be the building as well that Hastings said he most wanted to be remembered for. It was the one that he felt was the most important. And slightly later, when the commission came up to design the Tomb of the Unknowns, the base was designed by Hastings, but the Defense Department, War Department committee chose a veteran who was also a sculptor to design the actual tomb. And so we begin and end, as we must, here at Whitehall and Henry Flagler's role. And I hope that we've given you a little bit of a sense that when you're experiencing Whitehall here, it is certainly central to Palm Beach. And the ambitions expressed here, it is a white, very white city building here in Palm Beach when there weren't a lot of monumental buildings, expresses a larger national cultural ambition that Henry Flagler supported in the work of Carrère and Hastings that had resonance throughout the United States and still shapes our image of American architecture today. Thank you. I believe Heather and I will be taking questions if you have any. Well-behaved group. We've got dinner reservations. Yes, sir.
That's cute.
They were extremely prolific from what I can see here. How large was the firm? How many people were being employed?
There were we know of over 600 commissions, and that includes commissions in Canada, Paraguay, Cuba, London, and in England. We don't know. Their office records were destroyed when Hastings broke up the firm, and Hastings' own records were destroyed when his house burned down in 1913. There is a long list, some of which we go into in the book, of architects who went through their studio. We believe at one point on the New York Public Library they were employing close to 100 draftsmen at one time. So I think it went up and down with business.
cast them in the light of international architecture? I'm thinking of the Riva or
Would you? Hastings was the question was their international role. Hastings was the second American architect after Charles Follen McKim to be awarded the gold medal by the Royal Institute of British Architects. And that was a little controversial, partly because Hastings had taken in quite a few British architects, and again, in this sort of internship system, they had worked for him and gone back to England, and then he went over and collaborated with some British architects and the Devonshire House. Such to the complaint that certain younger architects in England complained that British architecture was becoming too Americanized. And their Beaux-Arts buildings in the teens all looked like Carrère and Hastings, and they looked like American buildings. But I think that that suggests the level of respect which they commanded internationally, and it's a bit of a shame that Carrère didn't live quite long enough to see some of that acclaim come in. Hastings was also awarded the Order of the Chevalier de la Légion d'Honneur in France for his services and his in France. I don't know actually of any projects that he did in France, but as a Francophile, I suppose the French realized that he was their best ambassador for their architecture in the United States. And their work in other countries, still much of that remains to be explored. Unfortunately, we didn't get a big enough advance to go to Paraguay. Well, sadly, most of their major Canadian commissions have been destroyed. But
I have a suggestion. Couldn't this bespeak of Ms. Henry Flagler's background heritage? That would be the grandest mansion of the whole South.
the question was, did this building reflect Henry Flagler's heritage? And it wasn't the grandest mansion of the whole South. Well, Biltmore was already there. It wasn't exactly the same style, so he had some competition. But yes, I have noted, well, Mr. Flagler grew up about 8 miles from where I grew up in upstate New York, where there's a lot of pretty remarkable Greek Revival architecture. And I think that that very much played into his affinity for this kind of design, yes. So it was a perfect architect-patron collaboration. Plus, when Henry Flagler said jump, architects said how high.
That's true.
Yes.
Did Carrère or Hastings have any comments or thoughts about those architects of their time who were breaking away from the Beaux-Arts tradition in America?
The question was, did Carrère and Hastings have any comments about architects in America? I imagine you're thinking of Sullivan, for example, or Wright, who were breaking away from the Beaux-Arts tradition. Not that I know of. I know that Hastings wrote an article in the 1890s that was somewhat critical, or I would say it was concerned about the impact on the quality of life of urban residents of the skyscraper. He was concerned that the scale of the skyscraper was going to lead to sort of dehumanized scale, that the streets would be dark. Of course, in those days, they didn't have emissions control on early automobiles, and they didn't have emissions control on how people heated their offices and apartments, so the air quality was pretty grim as well. That was later interpreted as Carrère and Hastings are anti-skyscraper, and they're anti-change. And in fact, Carrère and Hastings designed quite a few tall buildings, tall for the time, including the Standard Oil Tower in lower Manhattan. And when Hastings died in 1929 of appendicitis, he had just agreed to collaborate with 2 of his former students on the design of the Empire State Building. So he wasn't exactly anti-skyscraper. Question from online.
In what way did the look of the firm's commissions change after Carrère's death?
Good question. In what way did the look of the firm's commissions, their design, change after Carrère's death? It is very difficult in the absence of office records to assign certain designs to Carrère and certain designs to Hastings. For a long time, it was believed that Hastings did all the design and Carrère was just the administrator. But we can tell from some of the correspondence with patrons that some of these more Norman-looking buildings, like the Harriman House, or there's one in Pennsylvania, Cairnwood, for Pitt Cairn, the head of PPG Glass, were largely Carrère's work. But it was a very collaborative office. The people who worked there later talked about how they would do a sketch, Hastings would come over and comment on it and scribble on it and say, go over and talk to this guy, he just had a great idea for a doorway. I think that their work probably did become more uniformly French and neoclassical, and that more sort of Northern European rustic Norman Tudor look declined. But I don't know how much of that was a shift in fashion and how much of it was Carrère's influence waning. So I really can't say for sure, but that's my speculation. Yes?
Being so rooted in the Beaux-Arts tradition, I'm interested in the technological innovations that these young men seem to pioneer in terms of concrete, electricity, hydraulics, all of those things. Where were they exposed to that? Is that, were they exposed to it, or is it just sort of youthful exuberance and experimentation?
The question was, with the technical innovations of electricity, concrete, hydraulics, where did they learn this stuff? We're not 100% sure on the details, but Carrère studied at a technical institute, basically the MIT of Switzerland. And Switzerland and Germany were really big on the development of concrete technology. When they came to St. Augustine, there were Franklin W. Smith, who had studied concrete technology in the German tradition, was also there in town. And in fact, Flagler kind of played them off against each other. I think, you know, it was new technology and kind of wanted to see what that creative tension would bring up. So, and concrete had been used some in the United States for utilitarian buildings and bridges. But generally, I think it's safe to say that Carrère was more of the engineer. The connection to the electrical stuff is because Tommy Hastings' brother Frank, before he was E.C. Benedict's private secretary, was the president of Edison Electric Company. So I think he had an in there. And Henry Flagler was an acquaintance, if not a friend, of Thomas Edison, which didn't hurt either. And in terms of the hydraulics, perhaps Mr. Blades knows more about that. I know there are discussions on the St. Augustine project on the hydraulics, and I really honestly did not delve too far into that because it gets over my head too quickly. But on the relocation of the Croton Aqueduct in New York, again, that was Carrère. Heather, do you
No, I don't know much of it either, but it's extensive, and there was passive air conditioning systems that they had also figured out, and I'm not sure, I don't know if you know where that's coming from, but they had done a lot of experimenting.
And that die was cast at the Columbian Exposition. That marriage of Beaux-Arts architecture and technology was hallmark of that there. So.
Yeah, and Mr. Blade said, you know, the marriage of the latest technology and traditional architecture was really cemented at the World's Columbian Exposition. That's what it was about. And that's really what the American Renaissance was about, taking these traditional forms and bringing them up to date. And certainly at things like the Ponce de Leon Hotel, if you were trying to attract people to a luxury resort, then as now, it can be as beautiful as you want, but if the light switch doesn't work, it's not very luxurious.
Question way at the back.
Yes, in the back, sir.
Yeah. How does Whitehall compare in size with other houses that Carrère and Hastings designed to build?
Leave it to a museum trustee to ask that question, by the way. That's John Rogers, one of the trustees of the museum.
Hello, Mr. Rogers. The question was, how size-wise, how does Whitehall compare? It's pretty big. It is definitely one of the larger houses. It's not as large as Harriman's house. Harriman's house, Arden House, was the third largest house in the United States at the time. Biltmore was and remains, I believe, the largest. The second was the Stokesbury Estate outside of Philadelphia. Arden House was the third.
And among Carrère and Hastings commissions, how did this compare?
It's big-ish. I would say it's 200 plus residential commissions. I would say it's probably top 10 at least, if not top 5. Yes, sir.
One follow-up question. This house was built very rapidly. Do they have a history of building their buildings quickly, like Whitehall was built, or was this just very unusual?
Whitehall went up in about 18 months. I was just less than 2 years, which is pretty astonishing. It took me almost not long to fix the foundations of my house, which is about as big as this room. So how did they, is that typical of their work? Where they had a private commission and a client like Henry Flagler cracking the whip, they built quickly. I mean, they built the Ponce de Leon in about 2 years. So they could move along when they had a private commission. A government commission like the New York Public Library took 14 years, but it wasn't for the lack of workmen or other factors. So they just had the resources and to get these things done. And I mean, it's absolutely astonishing. With nothing, you know, wasn't all sort of prefab the way it is now, and they just got it done.
What would have been Carrère and Hastings' role in the supervision of the New York Public Library, for example? I mean, it's immense to think of the number of rooms, number of drawings, and all the mechanical system work that had to be done.
The question was, and it's a really good question, what were the architects, how involved were they in overseeing construction? And I'm hogging out my far more involved than most, and particularly again Carrère was extremely involved. Very early on in the Ponce de Leon project, their first major project, in fact when the builders were staking out the outline of the building, they wired telegrams back to New York, well the thing doesn't line up. And Carrère said, well, where did you start? Well, we started at the northeast corner. You start from a center line. Do I have to come down there and show you? And Henry Flagler said, I think you better come down here and show them. So, and there's some really wonderful letters and entries in Carrère's journals about going to visit projects under construction. So they were extremely involved. In the New York Public Library, they both moved. Hastings lived about 2 blocks away from the construction site, and Carrère was a few blocks further afield, and they were there all the time, every day. Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank all of you for being here this evening. I hope you enjoyed that lecture as much as I did. I think that's just about the perfect lecture in the sense that we're hearing about a subject that's so relevant in a room that couldn't be more relevant, right? And done so well. Thank you to both of you. You really did a terrific job, and I learned a lot, and I'll have to watch this many times online after it's archived online, and maybe you will too, just to absorb more of it. I invite you all to take a look at the season program guide you found at your seats. There are a lot of programs here going on during the season here at Whitehall. I hope you'll join us for some of the others, including our Whitehall Lecture Series. This year is the 100th anniversary of the completion of the Oversea Railroad, the most ambitious engineering feat ever undertaken by a private citizen. And we are celebrating that in part by we built a lecture series around the theme of great American engineering, great engineering feats of the Gilded Age. And our next lecture is about Ferris's Wheel from the Columbian Exposition. It was America's response to the Eiffel Tower. If they can build something big and beautiful out of steel, why not build something big and beautiful that moves out of steel? And that's how we wound up with the Ferris wheel that's become a ubiquitous part of every fair in the country since. So I hope you'll think about joining us for that lecture on Sunday at 3 o'clock. If you can't be here physically, be here. Join us on the web. All of these lectures are webcast live. You can join us from anywhere in the world. Heather and Laurie will be at the back of the room signing books if you like. And thank you again for being here. Enjoy the evening. I hope you did as well.